The envelope wasn't supposed to reach me. It had been sitting in a locked drawer for almost a year, forgotten, hidden, or maybe deliberately buried. The lawyer's assistant hesitated before handing it over, her fingers lingering on the edge like she wasn't sure she should be giving it to me at all. "I think this belongs to you," she said quietly. Inside was a letter. And a number. A number so large it didn't feel real. And a sentence that made my hands start shaking. "Christine, if you are reading this, it means they didn't tell you. My name is Christine Harper. I'm 59 years old. And until that moment, I believed my family, what little I had left, was honest with me. I was wrong. I've lived in the same modest house for over 30 years. Small kitchen. Faded cabinets. A backyard that I kept alive out of sheer stubbornness more than skill. My life was simple. Predictable. Quiet in a way that felt safe. I worked as a school administrator. Nothing glamorous, but steady. I paid my bills on time. Helped where I could. Stayed close to family, even when it wasn't always easy. Especially when it wasn't easy. My Uncle George passed away a little over a year ago. At least, that's when I was told. The call came on a Tuesday morning while I was making coffee. My cousin, his daughter, kept it brief. "He's gone," she said flatly. "Heart failure. No warning. No softness. Just information." I remember standing there, the kettle still humming behind me, trying to process how a man who used to send me handwritten birthday cards could disappear from my life in a single sentence. "What about the funeral?" I asked. "It's already been handled," she replied. "Small. Private. I wasn't invited." That should have been the first sign. But grief does strange things. It makes you quiet. It makes you accept things you normally wouldn't question. I told myself they were closer. That maybe he had changed in his final years. That maybe I just didn't matter as much anymore. So I let it go. Months passed. Then a year. No one mentioned his name again. No conversations about his house. His belongings. Nothing about what he left behind. It was like he had been erased. And I let that happen. Until today. I sat across from the lawyer's desk, the letter trembling in my hands. The office smelled faintly of old paper and coffee. Outside, I could hear traffic, normal life continuing, completely unaware that mine had just cracked open. "I don't understand," I whispered. The assistant avoided my eyes. He specifically asked that this be delivered if certain conditions weren't met. "What conditions?" She hesitated. "That you were informed. Properly." My chest tightened. "They told me he died." She nodded slowly. "Yes. But that's not all he expected them to tell you." I looked back down at the letter. At the number again. And then at the signature at the bottom. His handwriting. Unmistakable. That was the moment something cold settled deep in my stomach. Because if my uncle had expected them to tell me more. And they didn't. Then what else had they been hiding from me? And why? Looking back, the signs were always there. Not obvious. Not dramatic. Just slightly off. The kind of things you notice in passing and then immediately explain away because it's easier than asking uncomfortable questions. My cousin, Laura, and I were never especially close, but we weren't distant either. We grew up seeing each other at holidays, family dinners, the occasional birthday. She was always a little sharper than the rest of us, quicker to judge, quicker to smile when something didn't quite land right. Uncle George used to joke about it. She got that from her mother, he'd say, half smiling, half warning. I didn't think much of it at the time. But now certain memories feel different. About 6 months before he died, or before I was told he died, he called me out of nowhere. It was a Sunday afternoon. I remember because I had just finished trimming the hedges in my backyard, and my hands still smelled faintly of cut grass. "Christine," he said, his voice unusually serious. "Have you spoken to Laura recently?" I laughed lightly. "Not really." "Why?" There was a pause. A long one. "I just want to make sure you're all right," he added. Something about the way he said it made me frown. "I'm fine." "Why wouldn't I be?" Another pause. "No reason," he said finally. "Just checking." That should have stayed with me longer than it did. But life moves on. Work piles up. Bills need paying. Small worries get buried under routine. I didn't call him back. That was the last real conversation we had. A few weeks later, Laura started calling me more often. At first, it felt almost nice. "Hey, just checking in," she'd say. "We don't talk enough." We talked about nothing important. Weather. Work. Random family updates. She never mentioned her father's health. Never hinted that anything was wrong. If anything, she sounded relaxed. Too relaxed. Then there was the day I stopped by Uncle George's house. It wasn't planned. I was driving back from the grocery store, and something just pulled me in that direction. A strange instinct I couldn't explain. His house looked the same from the outside. Neatly kept. Curtains drawn halfway, like always. But when I rang the bell, Laura opened the door almost immediately. She looked surprised. Not pleasantly surprised. Just caught. "Oh," she said. "Christine. I didn't know you were coming." "I was in the area," I replied. "Is Uncle George home?" There was that pause again. That same hesitation I would later learn to recognize. "He's resting," she said. "Not feeling well today." I tried to step inside, but she didn't move aside. It was subtle. Easy to miss if you weren't paying attention. But I noticed. "Maybe I can just say hello?" I suggested. She shook her head quickly. "It's better if he rests." Something tightened in my chest. "Is everything okay?" "Of course," she said, too quickly. "You worry too much." That line. I've heard it so many times since. You worry too much. I nodded, even though something didn't sit right. "All right. Tell him I stopped by." "I will," she said, already closing the door. But as it shut, I caught a glimpse of something behind her. A stack of papers on the hallway table. Thick. Organized. Official looking. At the time, I didn't question it. I told myself it was nothing. Just documents. Bills. Insurance. Normal life. But now, sitting in that lawyer's office with my uncle's letter in my hands, I couldn't stop thinking about that moment. About the way she blocked the doorway. About the way her voice tightened when I asked questions. About the papers. And one thought kept repeating in my mind, louder with every second. What was happening in that house that I wasn't allowed to see? After leaving the lawyer's office, I didn't go home right away. I sat in my car for a long time. Engine off. Hands still on the steering wheel. The letter resting on the passenger seat like something alive, something I wasn't ready to fully face yet. I read it again. And again. Every word felt heavier the second time. They didn't tell you. The sentence echoed in my head like a quiet accusation. Who were they? I already knew the answer. But I needed to hear it out loud. So I did something I hadn't done in months. I called Laura. She picked up on the third ring. Christine? Her voice sounded normal. Too normal. Hi, I said, trying to keep my tone steady. I was at a lawyer's office today. Silence. Just for a second. But it was enough. Oh? She replied lightly. Everything okay? That was the moment I felt it. That shift. Like we were no longer having the same conversation. I received something, I continued. Something from Uncle George. Another pause. Longer this time. What do you mean? She asked. I closed my eyes for a second. He left a letter. For me. The silence that followed wasn't confusion. It wasn't surprise. It was calculation. You must be mistaken, she said finally. Not that's impossible. Not I didn't know. Just. You must be mistaken. My grip tightened on the phone. It has his signature. His handwriting. Well, she said, a little sharper now, there were a lot of documents. You know how these things are. Lawyers send things late all the time. That didn't sound right. Not even close. And the inheritance? I asked quietly. This time, she didn't answer immediately. What inheritance? She said. There it was. The first lie I could clearly hear. I let out a slow breath. The one mentioned in the letter. Another pause. You're overthinking this, she said, her tone softening again. Grief can make things feel bigger than they are. Grief. A year later. That word hit me like something rehearsed. I wasn't even at the funeral, Laura. That was your choice, she replied quickly. No, it wasn't. But she said it with such confidence, such calm certainty, that for a split second, I almost questioned myself. Almost. That's not how I remember it, I said slowly. Well, she sighed, we can't rewrite the past, Christine. Rewrite the past. The words settled in my chest like something dark and heavy. Did Uncle George leave anything to me? I asked directly. Silence. Then. I don't think this conversation is productive, she said. Click. She hung up. I stared at my phone. Heart pounding. Hands cold. That wasn't confusion. That wasn't misunderstanding. That was avoidance. Deliberate. Careful. Practiced. And for the first time, I allowed myself to think something I had been unconsciously avoiding all day. This wasn't just about a letter. This wasn't just about money. This was something they had planned. Something they had agreed not to tell me. Something they thought I would never find out. I looked back at the envelope on the seat beside me. At my name written in my uncle's handwriting. And one question began to form, slowly, clearly, and impossible to ignore. How many people knew and chose to stay silent? I didn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Laura's face. Calm. Controlled. Too composed for someone who had just been confronted with something she supposedly knew nothing about. It didn't make sense. Unless she was lying. By morning, the uneasiness had turned into something sharper. Clarity. I needed to know if she was the only one. Or if this went deeper. So I started making calls. The first was to my older cousin, Daniel. We weren't close, but he had always been neutral. The kind of person who stayed out of conflict. Or at least, that's what I thought. Christine? He answered, sounding surprised. Why, it's been a while. Yes, I said. Listen, I need to ask you something about Uncle George. A pause. Not long. But noticeable. What about him? He asked carefully. I was at a lawyer's office yesterday, I said. Apparently, he left something for me. Silence. Then a quiet exhale. I don't really know anything about that, Daniel replied. His tone was polite. Too polite. Were you at the funeral? I asked. Yes, he said immediately. Of course he was. Why wasn't I told? Another pause. This one longer. I assumed you knew, he said. That sentence. So simple. So clean. And yet it erased all responsibility. You assumed? I repeated. Well, Laura said she had informed everyone, he added. There it was. Laura again. Always Laura. I was never informed, I said. Daniel didn't respond right away. And when he finally did, his voice had changed. Softer. Lower. Christine, maybe it's better not to dig into this. The words landed like a warning. Why? I asked. Another silence. I just think it could create unnecessary tension, he said. Unnecessary. That word made something inside me snap. Daniel, did Uncle George leave a will? A longer pause now. I could almost hear him thinking. Calculating. Yes, he said finally. My heart skipped. Did it mention me? Silence. Daniel. I think you should talk to Laura about this, he said quickly. I already did. And? She hung up on me. Another pause. Then. Well, she's been under a lot of stress, he muttered. Stress? Of course. Always an explanation. Always a reason. Never an answer. Daniel, I said slowly, choosing each word carefully, is there something I'm not being told? This time, the silence was different. He didn't rush to fill it. Didn't deflect immediately. For a moment I thought he might actually tell me the truth. But then, I don't want to get involved, he said. And just like that, the door closed again. One by one. Carefully. Deliberately. I ended the call and stared at the wall in front of me. It was happening again. That same pattern. Pause. Deflect. Minimize. Redirect. Like they were all following the same script. Like this had been discussed. Agreed upon. Coordinated. I picked up my phone again. Scrolled through my contacts. Names I hadn't called in years. Family. People who shared the same blood, the same history, the same silence. And a question formed in my mind, one I wasn't sure I was ready to answer. If they all knew. If they all chose not to tell me. Then what did that say about my place in this family? And more importantly, what exactly were they trying so hard to keep from me? By the afternoon, I couldn't sit still anymore. Thinking wasn't enough. I needed to see something real. Something that couldn't be explained away with careful words and polite lies. So I drove back to Uncle George's house. The same street. The same quiet neighborhood. The same row of houses that hadn't changed in decades. But something felt different the moment I turned the corner. At first, I couldn't place it. Then I saw it. The car in the driveway wasn't Laura's. It was newer. Dark grey. Clean in a way that didn't match the rest of the street. I slowed down. My hands tightened on the wheel. That's strange, I whispered to myself. I parked across the street this time. Not directly in front. I don't know why. Maybe instinct. Maybe I already felt like I wasn't supposed to be there. The house looked almost the same. But not quite. The curtains were different. The front steps had been repainted. Small changes. Too small for a year of neglect. Too deliberate for coincidence. I got out of the car slowly. The air was cool, carrying that faint smell of damp earth and something metallic, like rain was coming. As I walked up the path, my heart started beating faster. Not from fear. From something else. Recognition. This wasn't just a visit anymore. This was trespassing into something I had been deliberately kept out of. I rang the bell. Once. Twice. Footsteps. But not the ones I expected. The door opened. And it wasn't Laura. A man stood there. Mid-40s, maybe. Casual clothes. Slightly confused expression. Yes? He said. I blinked. I'm sorry, I said quickly. I think I have the wrong house. He frowned slightly. This is 214, right? Yes, I said. He nodded. Then you're in the right place. My stomach dropped. I'm looking for George, I said slowly. The man's expression changed. Not dramatically. Just enough. George? He repeated. He passed away last year. I know, I said. I'm his niece. That word hung in the air. Niece. It should have meant something. It didn't. Oh, he said. We bought the house from his daughter. Bought. The word hit me harder than I expected. You bought it? I repeated. Yeah, he said casually. About 10 months ago, I think. 10 months. That meant it had been sold almost immediately after his death. My pulse started pounding in my ears. Did you deal with a lawyer? I asked. Of course, he said. Everything was handled pretty quickly, actually. Quickly. Of course it was. Was there anyone else involved? I pressed. Other family members? He hesitated. Just slightly. Not that I recall, he said. Another careful answer. Another almost truth. I nodded slowly, trying to keep my expression neutral. Thank you, I said. No problem, he replied, already stepping back. And then the door closed. Just like that. I stood there for a moment. On the front steps of a house that used to feel familiar. That used to feel like part of my life. And now, I wasn't even part of its history anymore. Sold. Handled. Closed. Without me. I walked back to my car slowly. Each step heavier than the last. Because now I knew something for certain. This wasn't just about a hidden letter. They didn't just keep information for me. They moved fast. They finalized things. They erased my place before I even realized it was gone. I sat behind the wheel, staring at the house. And one thought settled in, cold and sharp. If they were this quick to sell everything, then what else had they already taken? I didn't start the engine right away. Instead, I sat there in silence, staring at the house that no longer belonged to anyone I knew, trying to process what I had just heard. The word sold kept echoing in my mind, colliding with everything I thought I understood about my family. It wasn't just that they hadn't told me. It was that they had acted quickly, decisively, almost as if they were afraid of something, afraid that time itself might expose them. Slowly, I reached for the envelope again. My hands were steadier now, but there was a different kind of tension in them, something sharper, more focused. I unfolded the letter carefully, smoothing the paper against my knee as if that might somehow make the truth easier to read. This time, I didn't skim it. I read every line, every word, every pause in his handwriting. And that's when I saw it. Not the number. I had already noticed that. It was impossible not to. It was the paragraph beneath it. I must have skipped it before, overwhelmed by the shock. But now, the meaning landed with full force. The funds are to remain untouched until Christine is personally informed and has acknowledged receipt. No transfers are to be completed without her written consent. I stopped breathing. For a moment, the world outside the car seemed to disappear. The street, the houses, even the distant sound of traffic faded into nothing. There was only that sentence, repeating itself over and over again in my mind, each time cutting deeper than the last. No transfers. Without her consent. That wasn't a suggestion. That was a condition. Which meant. I flipped the page, scanning the rest of the document more urgently now. There were legal terms, signatures, dates. References to accounts. Instructions written with a level of clarity that made it impossible to misunderstand his intentions. He hadn't just left me something. He had protected it. Protected it from them. A cold realization began to settle in, slow and heavy. If the house had already been sold, if everything had been handled quickly, then one of two things had to be true. Either they had ignored his instructions, or they had found a way around them. Neither option was innocent. I leaned back in the seat, my heart pounding again, but this time it wasn't confusion driving it. It was something else. Something clearer. Anger. Not loud. Not explosive. Quiet. Controlled. The kind that builds when pieces finally start falling into place. I thought about Laura's voice on the phone. About Daniel's hesitation. About the way every conversation seemed to circle around the truth without ever touching it. They weren't confused. They weren't grieving. They were managing something. Containing it. And suddenly, a new question surfaced, one that hadn't fully formed until now. If my uncle had gone out of his way to include that condition, if he had anticipated that I might not be told, then what exactly did he think they were capable of? I looked down at the letter again, my eyes tracing his signature at the bottom. The familiarity of it hurt in a way I hadn't expected. It wasn't just ink on paper. It was intention. Trust. And a warning. Because whatever this was, he had seen it coming. And now, sitting alone in my car with the truth unfolding piece by piece, I realized something that made my stomach tighten. I wasn't just uncovering a secret. I was stepping into something he had tried, and failed, to stop. I didn't go home after that. Instead, I turned the car around and drove straight back to the lawyer's office. The sky had already started to darken, low clouds pressing down over the city, and the first drops of rain tapped lightly against the windshield. It felt fitting. Like something was closing in. When I walked inside, the receptionist looked up with mild surprise. "Back again?" she asked. "Yes," I said, a little too quickly. "I need to speak to whoever handled my uncle's file." She hesitated for a moment, then nodded and picked up the phone. A few minutes later, I was sitting in a different office. Smaller. Dimmer. More private. Across from me sat a man in his early 60s, glasses low on his nose, his expression careful in the way professionals learn to be when they sense a situation is about to become complicated. "I'm Mr. Klein," he said. "I understand you have questions regarding George Harper's estate." Questions. That felt like an understatement. "I think something went wrong," I said, placing the letter on his desk and sliding it toward him. "Or maybe something was done wrong." He adjusted his glasses and began reading. Slowly. Thoroughly. Too thoroughly. The longer he read, the more his expression changed, subtly, but noticeably. His brows pulled together slightly. His lips pressed into a thin line. And then he looked up at me. "Where did you get this?" he asked. "It was given to me here," I replied. "Today." He nodded once, as if confirming something to himself. "I see." That was all he said. Just "I see." "Can you explain it to me?" I asked. Because from what I understand, nothing should have been transferred without my consent. He leaned back in his chair, folding his hands together. "That is correct," he said carefully. My chest tightened. Then how was the house sold? There it was. The question that had been building since I stood on those front steps. For a moment, he didn't answer. Instead, he reached for a folder on his desk and opened it, flipping through several pages with practiced precision. Paper shifted. A pen tapped once against the wood. And then he stopped. "I need to ask you something," he said. "Of course. Did you, at any point, sign a document acknowledging the estate? Perhaps a waiver, or transfer authorization?" "No," I said immediately. "I didn't even know there was an estate." He nodded slowly. "That's concerning." Concerning. The word felt almost too mild. "What does that mean?" I pressed. He looked down at the file again, then back at me. "It means," he said, choosing each word with care, "that according to these records a document does exist bearing your name and signature." For a second, I didn't understand. My mind simply refused to process it. "That's not possible," I said. He didn't argue. He didn't reassure me. He simply turned the folder toward me and slid a single page across the desk. "Take a look." My hands moved before I could stop them. I picked up the document. And there it was. My name. Printed clearly. And beneath it, a signature. My signature. Or at least something that looked exactly like it. The shape. The flow. The slight tilt at the end of the last letter. It was close enough to fool anyone who didn't know me. But I knew. I stared at it, my pulse roaring in my ears. "I didn't sign this," I said quietly. "Mr." Klein didn't respond immediately. He just watched me. Carefully. Measuring. "I believe you," he said after a moment. "But from a legal standpoint, that may not be enough." The room felt smaller suddenly. The air heavier. "So what are you saying?" I asked. "I'm saying," he replied, "that if this document was used to authorize transfers, then someone either obtained your signature under false pretenses." He paused. "Or forged it. Or this is a case of outright fraud." The word hung between us. Heavy. Final. Fraud. I looked back down at the paper, my hands starting to shake again. This wasn't just silence anymore. This wasn't just manipulation. This was something else entirely. Something deliberate. Something calculated. And for the first time, the full weight of it hit me. They didn't just hide the truth from me. They replaced me. The next day, I returned to Mr. Klein's office with a sense of purpose I hadn't felt before. I needed answers, not just shock or confusion. The rain had turned into a steady drizzle, painting the city streets with a grey blur, and the air smelled faintly of wet asphalt and damp leaves. I walked inside, soaked, my mind already racing with the one question that had been repeating itself all night. How did they actually use my signature? "Mr. Klein greeted me with a quiet nod. He didn't speak much. He never had to. He already knew the weight of what he was about to show me. I slid into the chair across from him, gripping the letter tightly in my hands, my knuckles white. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. Only the soft hum of the office printer in the next room filled the silence. Finally, he leaned forward and opened a file, spreading papers across his desk. "This," he said, tapping a sheet with his pen, "is the document in question. The authorization they used to transfer the estate." He slid it toward me. My eyes immediately went to the signature at the bottom. My signature. Or at least something so close it could fool anyone who didn't know me intimately. I stared, unable to comprehend it fully. "I didn't sign this," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "I've never seen it before." He didn't respond immediately. Instead, he pulled out another document, older, yellowed at the edges, and placed it beside the first. "Compare this," he said. "Do you recognize it?" I looked closer. My eyes widened. It was a bank form from 5 years ago, something I had signed for my uncle, helping him with a minor account issue. Nothing significant. Just a routine form. But the signature, the flow of the letters, the tilt at the end, it matched the new document almost perfectly. I felt my chest tighten. My mind clicked into place. They had taken something I had signed years ago, something innocuous, and reproposed it. Carefully. Deliberately. They hadn't forged it from scratch. They had exploited trust. My trust. My uncle's trust. My own past compliance. Tears pricked my eyes, not from sadness, but from rage. The realization hit me harder than anything before. They had planned this. They had known exactly what they were doing. Every step, every hesitation, every false word, they calculated it all, knowing I would never question a routine signature years ago. And you're saying this alone makes the house sale technically legal? I asked, my voice trembling. It complicates things, mister. Klein said. Legally, it may appear that you authorized the transfer. But morally, there's no justification. This was a deliberate manipulation, using your prior signature to bypass consent. I sank back in my chair, my hands gripping the edge of the desk. My mind raced, looping through every phone call, every comment, every subtle push of my cousin and Laura over the past year. Every little smile, every polite insistence, it was all part of this calculated plan. They had used my history against me, weaponized my trust, and I hadn't even seen it coming. For the first time, I felt the full weight of betrayal. Not just theft or deception. A cold, precise betrayal, using every tool they had to erase me from the inheritance, from the family's legacy, from my uncle's final wishes. And in that moment, the clarity struck. Nothing would ever be the same again. I had evidence now. Real evidence. The document. The comparison. The memory of the form I had innocently signed years ago. They had overstepped. And I would hold them accountable. A question surfaced, sharp and unavoidable. If they could do this to me, what else have they already hidden? What else have they taken under the guise of trust? The thought lingered, heavy in the room, and I knew that the next steps I took would define everything. I left Mr. Klein's office with a heavy heart and a head full of racing thoughts. Rain-slicked streets reflected the neon lights of the city, flickering like broken memories in my mind. Every step I took toward my car felt deliberate, almost ritualistic. I needed to piece this together before it consumed me entirely. Back in my apartment, I spread all the documents across the dining table, the cold fluorescent light casting harsh shadows over the scattered papers. Each one told a story, and each one pointed in the same direction. Deliberate deception. Old forms, new forms, dates that overlapped, signatures that matched almost too perfectly. It was methodical, precise, and horrifying. I started making a list. Dates. Names. Conversations. The subtle moments I dismissed as politeness or family quirks suddenly had sharp edges. Laura's insistence on just handling it for you, Christine, now sounded like a rehearsed line. My cousin's sudden interest in my schedule, the small questions about my whereabouts, the friendly smiles at the family gatherings, all of it, pieces of a puzzle I hadn't known existed. I remembered the night of the dinner party last year, the one where Uncle George had seemed unusually tense. He'd whispered something to me about protecting what matters most, then smiled quickly and walked away. At the time, I'd assumed it was some benign reminder about his health or the estate. Now, I realized he had been warning me, trying to give me a clue. And I hadn't listened. I pulled out my phone and started combing through old emails and messages. Small details jumped out. A forwarded document from Laura that I had thought was routine, a casual comment about finalizing Uncle George's matters, a question about whether I remembered signing something years ago for paperwork. I had ignored them, taken them at face value. And now they felt like breadcrumbs leading to a trap. Hours passed. My apartment smelled faintly of coffee and rain, the documents now forming a chaotic web on the table. And then it hit me, there was one piece missing. One key that could confirm everything. The original form I had signed years ago. If I could find that, I could prove the signature had been misused. And if I could prove misuse, then the house sale, the money transfers, the entire betrayal could be challenged. I realized I needed help. Not just legal help. Someone who could trace emails, verify documents, check signatures. Someone meticulous, someone relentless. Someone I could trust, because trusting my family was no longer an option. The phone rang, jolting me from the spiral of realization. It was Mr. Klein. "I've reviewed everything you brought me," he said. "And there's a pattern here. Whoever did this was careful, deliberate, and strategic. You're not imagining it." I closed my eyes, letting the words sink in. Not imagining it. Not paranoia. Reality. "Then we have to find the proof," I said. "I want everything, emails, documents, anything that shows they planned this." Mr. Klein paused. "Prepare yourself," he said. "Once we start digging, it's going to get ugly. You might discover things you weren't ready for." I swallowed hard, my hands shaking slightly. I knew he was right. And yet, a part of me felt something else. Clarity. Anger. Yes. Betrayal. Yes. But also power. Because now, for the first time in months, I was no longer a passive observer. I was about to uncover the full extent of their deception. I couldn't sleep that night. The documents, the emails, the evidence I had been combing through, they haunted me like shadows in my apartment. Every whisper of the rain against the window sounded like a warning, a drumbeat to the truth I had been avoiding. I kept thinking about my uncle, George, and the last time I saw him alive. How did I not see it then? How had I missed all the subtle signals that had been pointing to this betrayal? By mid-morning, I had resolved to confront them. Not just Laura. Not just my cousin. The entire chain of deception had to face me. I needed answers. I needed to see if any shred of honesty remained. I drove to my cousin's apartment, my hands gripping the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white. Each red light felt like a countdown, each passing car a reminder of how ordinary life had been while my world had been quietly unraveling. When I arrived, I saw them both in the living room, laughing as if nothing had happened, their casual smiles twisting into something I no longer recognized. My heart sank. I stepped inside, trying to steady my voice. "Can we talk?" I asked. Laura's eyes flicked toward me, masking something, but not fully hiding it. My cousin's expression faltered, just slightly. "Enough." "Sure," Laura said, with that calm, practiced tone I had come to hate. "What's this about?" I dropped the first set of documents onto the coffee table. Papers rustled as I spread them out, the signatures glaring back at them. My own signature, old forms, new forms, dates lining up perfectly to show the scheme they had orchestrated. I could see the color drain from their faces. Not enough to fool me. Not anymore. "You used my signature," I said, my voice rising with controlled fury. "You used it to take everything that was supposed to be mine. The house, the inheritance, you manipulated it all. Every single detail was planned." Laura laughed nervously, a sound that almost cracked. "Christine, it's not like that, not like that." I cut her off. "This is fraud." This is betrayal. This is every trust I ever placed in you and my family, thrown away while I was blind to it. My cousin opened his mouth, but no words came. He tried to interject, but my fury carried me forward. The injustice, the humiliation, the sheer audacity of their actions surged through me. You thought I wouldn't notice, I continued. You thought I'd take it quietly, smile, and pretend everything was fine. But I saw it. I see it now. And it's over. Silence fell in the room, heavy and suffocating. I could feel it pressing down on all of us. And for the first time, I felt something I hadn't felt in months. Control. The anger that had threatened to destroy me was now sharp, focused, and ready. I stood there, facing them, my hands still trembling from the adrenaline, but my eyes steady. I will make this right, I said quietly, but with a certainty that shook the air. Not for revenge, but for justice. For me. And for George. They had crossed a line. And now they were going to face the consequences. The days that followed were unbearable. Every phone call, every text, every small interaction with my family reminded me of the betrayal, and the weight of it pressed down like a physical force. I couldn't escape it, no matter how much I tried. Even simple tasks, like making coffee or sorting mail, felt tainted with the knowledge that they had used my own trust to rob me of what was mine. One evening, I found myself standing in the kitchen, staring blankly at the wall, the city lights outside the window casting long shadows that seemed to mimic the chaos in my mind. The documents were stacked neatly on the counter, but I didn't care. I couldn't stop thinking about the dinner parties, the smiles, the casual helping hands that had masked such calculated deceit. I felt like I had been living in a dream, only to wake up to a nightmare I had never imagined. Then came the call from Mr. Klein. Christine, he said, I've dug deeper. I've traced emails, bank records, everything. It's worse than we thought. They didn't just misuse your signature, they coordinated. Multiple people. Cousins, distant relatives, even the executor. They built a network around deceiving you. And they did it quietly, carefully, for years. My hands shook. My chest ached. I wanted to scream, to run, to shake them until they confessed every lie. I wanted to crumble, but I couldn't. Not now. Not after seeing how deliberate, how cold, how precise it had all been. I replayed memories I had long dismissed. The questions about which bank branch I preferred, the casual mentions of Uncle George's health issues, the way Laura always volunteered to handle every detail, every interaction suddenly felt sinister. I realized just how invisible I had been to them, how underestimated, how easy a target I had been because I believed in family. Then came clarity. A sharp, undeniable clarity. The betrayal was not just a shock. It was a revelation. And revelation is power. I cried. I raged. I sat on the floor surrounded by documents and memories and the raw ache of injustice. And then, in the middle of the storm, I made a decision. I would no longer be a victim. No longer overlooked, no longer manipulated. I would act. Not out of revenge, but out of necessity, out of self-preservation, out of reclaiming what was rightfully mine. That night, I drafted the first list. Who to contact, what to prove, which witnesses could corroborate, which steps I needed to take legally. Each line I wrote steadied my hands, focused my mind. For the first time in months, I felt a strange exhilaration. The tables were turning. And I was ready. The realization settled in with the weight of finality. They had tried to destroy me, but they had underestimated the strength they had always ignored. And now, everything was about to change. The morning after my decision, I felt a clarity I hadn't experienced in months. I got dressed deliberately, carefully choosing an outfit that made me feel strong. For once, I wasn't hiding. I wasn't shrinking. I was stepping into the fight, fully aware of what was at stake. First, I returned to Mr. Klein's office. He had prepared the initial legal filings to challenge the misuse of my signature and the distribution of Uncle George's estate. Seeing the paperwork in front of me, carefully outlined, methodical, undeniable, brought a strange mixture of relief and resolve. I was no longer powerless. The law, combined with my determination, could finally set things right. Over the next few days, I contacted witnesses, dug through old correspondences, and gathered every scrap of evidence that could corroborate my case. I called former bank employees, accountants, and even distant relatives who had been suspicious but too afraid to speak. Each conversation was emotionally draining, but each confirmed that my family's deception was extensive. They had built a house of lies, and I was about to knock it down brick by brick. At home, I changed everything. I removed their access to my accounts, redirected mail, and even replaced locks. I was no longer just reclaiming what was mine legally, I was reclaiming my personal space, my privacy, my life. It felt empowering in a way I hadn't imagined. Then came the confrontation. Not in a shouting match, not in a dramatized scene for revenge, but in calm, undeniable truth. I scheduled a family meeting, invited them under the guise of discussing Uncle George's estate, and laid everything on the table. Every document, every email, every piece of evidence was visible. The shock in their faces was satisfying, but not in a cruel way. This was justice, not vengeance. I trusted you, I said, voice steady. I believed in family. You chose to betray me instead. But I'm no longer silent. You have been exposed, and now you face the consequences of your actions. No apologies came. No excuses that held weight. Just stunned silence. And that silence felt like victory. Not because I wanted them to suffer, but because for the first time, I wasn't a victim in a story they had written for me. I was the author of my own chapter now. By the end of the week, I had secured temporary control over the estate, ensured the bank accounts were frozen pending legal review, and made it clear that any further deception would result in formal charges. The fear, the anxiety, the helplessness, they were replaced with a steady, unwavering determination. I was no longer living in someone else's shadow. I was standing in my own light. And as I sat in my apartment that evening, watching the city lights flicker across the rain-soaked streets, I finally felt something I had missed for years. Peace. It was hard-earned, and it was fragile, but it was mine. And for the first time in a long time, I believed I could keep it. Weeks passed, and the storm of legal battles and family confrontations began to settle. The chaos was no longer overwhelming me. It was something I could manage, something I could control. Each phone call with Mr. Klein, each meeting with witnesses, each signed document reinforced the reality. I was no longer at the mercy of deceit. I was reclaiming my life, piece by piece. Sitting in my living room one evening, I looked around at the quiet apartment that now felt like mine in every sense. The rain outside had stopped, and the city lights glimmered softly against the dark streets. I thought about George, about all the subtle warnings he had given me, the care he had shown in leaving me clues. I realized that I had learned more than I expected from this ordeal, not just about my family, but about myself. I had discovered a resilience I didn't know I possessed. I allowed myself a moment to grieve, not just for the betrayal, but for the lost trust, the fractured relationships, and the years I had spent under illusions. Tears flowed freely, and I let them. But with each tear, I felt lighter, stronger, more determined. I had survived their manipulation, their greed, their secrets. And I had emerged whole. I began to set new boundaries. I limited contact with those who had tried to deceive me, refusing to allow their presence to poison my life any longer. I cultivated relationships built on honesty, trust, and mutual respect. I took up old hobbies I had abandoned, and even started planning a small trip I had postponed for years. Every choice was mine. Every decision reaffirmed my independence. The estate issue was finally resolved. I regained rightful control over my inheritance, but more importantly, I had restored control over my narrative. I had turned betrayal into empowerment. Every court filing, every legal confrontation, every long night of organizing evidence had led to this. A victory not measured only in money or property, but in dignity and self-respect. As I stood by the window that evening, watching the city's lights reflect off puddles in the street, I felt a sense of closure unlike anything I had known before. This chapter had ended, but the story of my life was mine to write. I was no longer defined by betrayal or by the greed of others. I was defined by my strength, my clarity, and my courage to reclaim what was mine. And for the first time in decades, I felt truly free.